Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Soldier's Return. Colonel Troy Brennan had seen enough blood in his 23 years of military service to fill a lake, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of his wife Linda's car in the driveway of General Frank Morrison's off-base residence. The digital camera in his hands felt heavier than the rifle he'd carried through 3 deployments. Troy had returned early from what was supposed to be a 6-month training mission in Bulgaria. The official reason for his early return was a family emergency he'd fabricated through carefully forged medical documents, a skill he'd picked up during Black Ops missions where authenticity meant survival. The real reason sat captured in the memory card of his camera: 47 photographs of his wife's silver Lexus parked at Morrison's house over the past 2 weeks, license plate clearly visible. He'd been suspicious for months. Linda's sudden interest in evening yoga classes that somehow never resulted in improved flexibility. Her phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. The way she flinched when he touched her, as if his hands carried the stain of every mission he'd never spoken about. But it was the pregnancy test he'd found in her purse, positive, when they hadn't been intimate in 4 months, that had triggered his methodical investigation. Troy parked his black Silverado 3 houses down and activated the long-range listening device he'd borrowed from the base. Through his headphones, he could hear Morrison's voice. When he deploys to Syria next month, we'll have 6 months to figure this out. The kid doesn't have to be his problem. Linda's laugh was like shattered glass. Troy's so focused on being the perfect soldier, he never noticed he was failing as a husband. This baby deserves a father who's actually present. Morrison's response made Troy's blood freeze. Speaking of Troy, I've got something special planned for him. A mission that'll solve all our problems permanently. Troy had killed 43 enemy combatants in his career. He'd extracted information from prisoners using methods that weren't in any manual. He'd orchestrated the deaths of war criminals with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. But hearing his wife and commanding officer casually discuss his elimination while planning their future together awakened something darker in him than any battlefield had. He switched off the device and pulled out his encrypted satellite phone. His first call was to Master Sergeant Rico Vega, his most trusted operator and the only man who knew about Troy's off-books intelligence network. "Rico, I need a favor. Run a deep background check on General Morrison. Everything: finances, family, military record, personal connections. Especially any relatives serving overseas." "How deep we talking, Colonel?" "Ocean floor deep. And Rico? This stays between us." His second call was to Dr. Patricia Mills, a military psychiatrist who owed him her life after he'd extracted her from a compromised medical convoy in Afghanistan. She also happened to be Linda's yoga instructor, the real one. "Patricia, I need to know about my wife's attendance at your evening sessions." The pause told him everything. "Troy, Linda hasn't attended yoga in 3 months. She told me she was taking a break for personal reasons." After ending the call, Troy sat in his truck and felt the familiar calm that preceded every major operation. His wife and commanding officer had declared war on him without realizing they were facing a man who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of warfare. The irony wasn't lost on him. Morrison was about to send him on what he assumed would be a suicide mission, never knowing that Troy had already died the moment he heard their conversation. What Morrison would be facing when Troy returned wouldn't be the loyal soldier who had served under him for 8 years. It would be something much more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from their destruction. Chapter 2. The Impossible Mission. 3 days later, Troy sat in the sterile briefing room at Fort Harrison, studying the faces around the conference table. General Morrison commanded the room with his usual theatrical presence. But Troy now noticed the subtle tells he'd missed before. The way Morrison's eyes lingered on Troy's wedding ring. The slight smirk when discussing casualty projections. "Gentlemen, Operation Nightfall is a Priority 1 extraction," Morrison announced, clicking through satellite images on the projector. "Intelligence indicates that Captain Dale Morrison, no relation," he added with practiced casualness, "is being held at a terrorist compound in the Khost province. We need him alive." Troy almost smiled. Morrison's brother had been reported Kia 6 months ago, but according to Troy's private intelligence network, Dale Morrison had been captured and turned. He was now feeding information to enemy forces while maintaining his cover as a prisoner. The fact that Frank Morrison was lying about the family connection confirmed Troy's suspicions about the mission's true purpose. The compound is heavily fortified, Morrison continued. Intelligence suggests a 12-man garrison with advanced early warning systems. The extraction point is 15 clicks through hostile territory with no air support. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, Morrison's aide, leaned forward. Sir, with respect, this seems like a job for a full squad, not a single operator. Morrison's smile was knife-thin. Colonel Brennan volunteered for solo insertion. His experience with deep reconnaissance makes him uniquely qualified. Morrison's eyes found Troy's. You won't be coming back from this one, soldier. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around the table, Troy's fellow officers looked uncomfortable. Captain Hayes, who had served under Troy in Iraq, actually shifted in his seat, as if preparing to object. Troy stood slowly, his movements deliberate. When do I deploy, sir? Wheels up in 6 hours. Any questions? Just one. Troy's voice was steady, professional. What's the protocol if Captain Morrison is compromised? Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You're to extract him regardless of his condition. Those are your orders, Colonel. Understood, sir. As the briefing dispersed, Captain Hayes caught Troy's arm. This is bullshit, Troy. Morrison's sending you to die, and we all know it. Troy's expression remained neutral. Sometimes the mission requires sacrifice, Hayes. That's what we signed up for. But inside, Troy was already calculating. Morrison wanted him dead to clear the path for his affair with Linda. What Morrison didn't realize was that Troy had spent the past 72 hours preparing for this exact scenario. Hidden in his gear was a quantum-encrypted communication device that would allow him to maintain contact with Rico Vega throughout the mission. More importantly, Troy had already established contact with the very terrorists Morrison claimed were holding his brother. Through intermediaries in the Afghan intelligence community, Troy had negotiated a deal, safe passage to the compound in exchange for information about American military operations that Morrison had been selling to fund his off-base lifestyle. Morrison thought he was sending Troy to his death. Instead, he was sending him directly to the source of intelligence that would destroy both Morrison and Linda. 6 hours later, as Troy's transport lifted off from the tarmac, he reviewed the dossier Rico had compiled on the Morrison family. Dale Morrison hadn't just been captured, he'd been turned by his own brother's greed. Frank Morrison had been selling classified information for 2 years, using Dale as his point of contact with enemy forces. The pregnancy, the affair, the suicide mission, they were all part of Frank Morrison's plan to eliminate loose ends and start fresh. What Morrison hadn't counted on was that Troy Brennan didn't just eliminate enemies. He obliterated them. As the transport flew through the night sky toward Afghanistan, Troy closed his eyes and began the mental preparation ritual he'd used before every kill mission. By the time he reached the compound, Colonel Troy Brennan would be dormant. What emerged would be something Morrison had created but could never control, a weapon with a very specific target. Chapter 3: Blood and Brotherhood. The compound appeared exactly as intelligence had described. A fortified position carved into the mountainside with overlapping fields of fire and sophisticated early warning systems. What intelligence hadn't mentioned was that the entire facility was a front operation run jointly by Dale Morrison and the local Taliban commander. Troy approached the perimeter at 0300 hours, moving through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate without triggering multiple alarms. The fact that he reached the outer wall without incident confirmed his suspicions. This entire mission was theater, and he was the unwitting actor. He scaled the compound wall with practiced silence, dropped into the courtyard, and immediately found himself facing 3 AK-47 barrels. The men holding them wore the confident expressions of soldiers who had been expecting him. Colonel Brennan, the center figure said in accented English. You are right on schedule. Troy raised his hand slowly, letting his rifle fall to the ground. I'm here for Captain Morrison. Of course you are. He is waiting for you. They led him through corridors that felt more like a military command center than a terrorist hideout. The walls were lined with advanced communication equipment, satellite uplinks, and detailed maps of U.S. military positions throughout the region. Captain Dale Morrison sat behind a steel desk in what had once been the compound's interrogation room. He looked nothing like the broken prisoner Troy had expected to find. Dale was clean-shaven, well-fed, and wearing a uniform that combined American military elements with local tactical gear. Colonel Brennan, my brother said you might be paying us a visit. Troy remained standing, his eyes cataloging every detail of the room. Captain Morrison, I'm here to extract you. Dale laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Extract me? From what? This is the most successful operation I've ever run. He gestured to the equipment around them. 18 months ago, my dear brother Frank approached me with a proposition. Feed intelligence to local forces, help them avoid American operations, and split the proceeds from captured equipment and ransoms. You're a traitor. I'm a businessman. Frank needed someone on the ground to facilitate his information sales. I needed a way out of a military that was never going to promote me past captain. Dale stood, walking to a wall map marked with red pins. Each pin represents an American operation that was mysteriously compromised. Convoy routes that somehow ended up in enemy hands. Safe houses that weren't so safe. Patrol schedules that leaked to the exact forces they were meant to avoid. Troy felt something cold settle in his chest. How many Americans died because of your intelligence? 47 confirmed. Probably more. Dale's tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. Frank was very specific about which operations to compromise. Nothing too obvious, just enough to fund his lifestyle and clear out inconvenient people. Like me. Especially like you. Dale returned to his desk, pulling out a thick folder. Frank told me all about your wife. Beautiful woman. Pregnant with his child, from what I understand. He opened the folder, revealing surveillance photographs of Linda at various locations with Frank Morrison. He's been planning this for months. The Syria deployment, the suicide mission, even the fake family emergency that brought you home early. Troy's expression remained neutral despite the rage building in his core. He knew I came back early? Of course he knew. Frank's been monitoring your every move through base security systems. He wanted you to discover the affair, Colonel. He wanted you angry and unfocused when you came on this mission. Dale smiled, revealing teeth stained by years of tobacco use. He expected you to die in the assault on this compound. What he didn't expect was for you to walk through our front door. So what happens now? Dale leaned back in his chair. Now you radio back to base and report mission accomplished. Tell Frank that you captured me and I'm ready for extraction. He'll send a recovery team to a location I specify. And then you and I are going to have a very interesting conversation with my brother about family loyalty, business ethics, and the price of betrayal. Dale's smile turned predatory. You see, Colonel, Frank made a crucial error. He assumed that blood was thicker than profit. But I've been recording every conversation, every transaction, every order he's given me for the past 18 months. Dale pulled out a digital recording device and pressed play. Frank Morrison's voice filled the room. The Brennan problem needs to be permanent, Dale. I don't care how you do it, but he can't come back from this mission. Linda and I need him gone. Troy listened to 12 minutes of recorded conversations detailing not just his planned elimination, but the deaths of 6 other soldiers who had discovered various aspects of Frank Morrison's operation. When the recording ended, Dale looked at Troy with something approaching respect. Frank told me you were a dangerous man, Colonel. He was wrong. You're not dangerous. You're inevitable. And right now, Frank Morrison's inevitability is sitting in my compound, listening to evidence that will destroy him and everyone he's ever cared about. Troy smiled for the first time in 3 days. It was not a pleasant expression. Captain Morrison, I think it's time to call your brother. Chapter 4, The Spider's Web. 12 hours later, Troy keyed his radio from the compound's communications center, his voice carrying the exhausted tone of a soldier who had barely survived enemy contact. Base, this is Broken Arrow. Mission accomplished. Package secured but wounded. Requesting immediate medical extraction at grid reference 31-7-4-9-2. General Morrison's voice crackled through the static. Broken Arrow, confirm package status. Package is alive but critical. Possible internal injuries. We need a full medical team and transport. There was a pause that lasted exactly 17 seconds. Troy counted. When Morrison spoke again, his voice carried a subtle edge of surprise. Copy, Broken Arrow. Medical evac inbound to your position. ETA 4 hours. Troy switched off the radio and turned to Dale Morrison, who had been monitoring the conversation from a bank of surveillance equipment. He's surprised I'm alive. He's terrified you're alive, Dale corrected. Frank expected your body to be found in the rubble of this compound after a firefight went wrong. Instead, you've captured his brother and are requesting extraction. Dale pulled up a digital map showing aircraft movement. He'll send the medical team, but he'll also send a cleanup crew. Meaning Frank will have snipers positioned to eliminate both of us during the extraction. He can't risk me talking, and he can't let you return with evidence of his operation. Troy studied the tactical situation. The compound sat in a valley with limited approach routes, making it a perfect kill zone for anyone who controlled the high ground. Morrison would position his cleanup team on the surrounding ridges and eliminate both Morrison brothers during the extraction. What's your suggestion, Captain? Dale smiled, revealing a level of tactical intelligence that explained how he'd survived 18 months undercover. We give Frank exactly what he expects: 2 dead Morrison brothers and a hero story for the history books. Over the next 2 hours, Dale outlined a plan that was both elegant and brutal. Using the compound's extensive surveillance network, they would stage a firefight between Troy and the supposed terrorists holding Dale prisoner. The final scene would show Troy eliminating the terrorist leader who had been threatening Dale, only to be shot by a hidden sniper, Dale himself. Both Morrison brothers would appear to die in the firefight, giving Frank the clean resolution he needed. In reality, Dale would assume a new identity he'd been preparing for months, complete with extraction route and financial resources. Troy would be reported as killed in action, his body supposedly destroyed in the compound's destruction. And then, Troy asked, then we both become ghosts, Colonel, free to operate outside official channels with one common objective: destroying Frank Morrison and everyone who helped him. Troy considered the proposal. Faking his death would free him from military regulations, legal constraints, and moral obligations. He could pursue his revenge without risking court-martial or collateral damage to his military career. More importantly, it would allow him to return to the United States as a dead man, invisible to surveillance, unbound by law, and utterly free to dismantle Frank Morrison's life piece by piece. I'll need access to your intelligence files on Morrison's operation, Troy said. Already prepared. Dale handed him an encrypted drive. Everything Frank sold, everyone he betrayed, every transaction he made. Plus something extra, financial records showing that Linda has been receiving monthly payments from Frank for the past 6 months. Troy's expression didn't change, but Dale noticed his hands tighten imperceptibly. Your wife wasn't just having an affair, Colonel. She was a paid asset. Frank has been using her to monitor your activities, report on your schedule, and provide intelligence on your psychological state. The encrypted drive contained bank records showing $5,000 monthly deposits to Linda's personal account, along with detailed reports she had filed about Troy's behavior, mission schedules, and emotional state. The most recent report, dated 3 days before Troy's deployment, contained a psychological assessment recommending his elimination as increasingly unstable and potentially dangerous to operational security. She sold me, Troy said quietly. She sold you. She sold your marriage. And she sold 47 American soldiers. Dale's voice carried genuine disgust. Frank may have created this operation, but Linda made it possible. She provided the inside information that allowed Frank to target specific personnel and operations. Troy closed his eyes and felt the last remaining traces of Colonel Troy Brennan, husband, soldier, patriot, die in the cold mountain air of Afghanistan. What remained was something simpler and infinitely more dangerous, a weapon with a target. When does the medical team arrive? He asked. Dale checked his watch. 2 hours, 37 minutes. Then we have 2 hours, 37 minutes to plan Frank Morrison's funeral. Chapter 5, The Dead Man's Gambit. The medical extraction played out exactly as Dale had predicted. Frank Morrison's cleanup team arrived 30 minutes before the official medical helicopter, positioning 3 sniper teams on the surrounding ridges. Through the compound's surveillance system, Troy and Dale watched them establish overlapping fields of fire that would eliminate both Morrison brothers the moment they appeared in the extraction zone. The staged firefight began at 1,400 hours. Using pre-positioned explosive charges and carefully choreographed movements, Troy and Dale created the appearance of a desperate battle between American forces and entrenched terrorists. Smoke grenades obscured the surveillance cameras at crucial moments, allowing them to move bodies and rearrange the scene. The climax came when Troy appeared to eliminate the terrorist leader threatening Dale, only to be shot by a hidden sniper, Dale himself, firing blanks while a concealed explosive charge created the illusion of a fatal hit. Both men collapsed in positions that would make positive identification impossible from the sniper positions. Through his earpiece, Troy heard Frank Morrison's voice directing the cleanup team. Confirm both targets are down. I want positive identification on the bodies. The lead sniper's response was professional. 2 Kia confirmed, General. Both Morrison brothers eliminated. Compound is clear for demolition. Copy. Initiate thermite charges and withdraw. Make it look like the terrorists destroyed the facility to prevent intelligence recovery. As the cleanup team withdrew, Troy and Dale moved through the compound's hidden tunnels to a cave system that Dale had prepared as an emergency extraction route. Behind them, the compound erupted in a series of explosions that would leave nothing but rubble and the charred remains of 2 carefully selected corpses. 6 hours later, Troy and Dale sat in a safe house in Kabul that officially didn't exist. Dale had activated an extraction network he'd built over 18 months, complete with new identities, financial resources, and transportation assets. Frank will report that both of us died heroes, Dale said, monitoring American military communications. You eliminated a high-value target and rescued a fellow officer at the cost of your own life. He'll probably recommend you for a posthumous Medal of Honor. Troy was studying the intelligence files on Frank Morrison's network, cross-referencing financial records with operational timelines. How extensive is his operation? Broader than you know. Frank wasn't just selling information. He was manipulating entire missions to create profitable outcomes. The convoy attack that killed Lieutenant Rodriguez? Frank altered the route to drive it through a prepared ambush. The failed raid on the terrorists' safe house in Kandahar? Frank warned them 12 hours in advance. Troy found the file he was looking for. Operation Crimson Shield, a joint operation between American and Afghan forces that had resulted in the deaths of 16 American soldiers. According to Dale's records, Frank Morrison had sold the operational details to enemy forces for $200,000. This operation, Troy pointed to the file. Captain Hayes lost his entire squad. Frank needed a high-casualty event to justify increased security measures that would give him access to more classified information. Hayes' squad was sacrificed for Frank's career advancement. Troy closed the file and looked at Dale with the expression he'd worn before eliminating high-value targets. I want Frank Morrison to understand exactly what he's lost before he dies. I want him to see his career destroyed, his reputation ruined, his family connections severed. I want him to lose everything that matters to him. And your wife? Linda stopped being my wife the moment she took Frank's money. Now she's just another enemy asset that needs to be neutralized. Dale nodded, understanding the cold mathematics of revenge. What's the plan? Troy pulled out a detailed map of Fort Harrison and the surrounding civilian areas. We return to the United States as ghosts. No official identity, no military records, no legal constraints. Frank thinks he's eliminated his problems, which means he'll be careless. And Linda? Linda is pregnant with Frank's child and believes she's a widow. She'll be vulnerable, isolated, and dependent on Frank for emotional support. That dependency will become a weapon. Over the next 4 hours, Troy and Dale outlined a comprehensive plan that would systematically destroy Frank Morrison's life while maintaining the illusion that both Morrison brothers were dead. Dale would remain overseas, feeding false intelligence to Frank's remaining network while documenting every transaction. Troy would return to the United States and begin the careful work of psychological warfare. Frank has a son from his first marriage, Dale noted, pulling up a family file. Kevin Morrison, age 19, sophomore at West Point. Frank's pride and joy. Troy studied the young man's photograph and academic records. What kind of relationship do they have? Complicated. Kevin idolizes his father but resents the military lifestyle that kept Frank away during his childhood. Frank has been trying to repair their relationship by involving Kevin in his business activities. Meaning, Kevin has been unknowingly carrying messages between Frank and his civilian contacts. Frank told him it was related to intelligence consulting, but Kevin has been functioning as a courier for the operation. Troy smiled, recognizing an opportunity. If Kevin discovered what his father was really doing, it would destroy him. The kid has a moral compass that makes Boy Scouts look ethically flexible. Finding out his father is responsible for American deaths would break him completely, or it would turn him into an ally. Dale considered this. You want to recruit Frank Morrison's son? I want to give Kevin Morrison the choice between being his father's victim or his father's judge. Frank destroyed Kevin's innocence by involving him in the operation. Kevin deserves the chance to restore his honor. As they finalized their plans, Troy felt the familiar calm that preceded every major operation. Frank Morrison had declared war on him by sending him on a suicide mission, corrupting his wife, and causing the deaths of 47 American soldiers. What Frank didn't understand was that war was Troy Brennan's natural habitat. And in this war, there would be no prisoners, no mercy, and no survivors. Frank Morrison was about to learn why Colonel Troy Brennan had been the military's most feared operator. Unfortunately for Frank, he would learn it as a civilian. Chapter 6. The Ghost Returns. 3 weeks later, a man who had never existed crossed the Canadian border into Washington state using identification documents that were simultaneously perfect and completely fictional. The passport identified him as Marcus Webb, a private security consultant returning from a contract in Eastern Europe. The background files supporting this identity included employment records, tax returns, and a credit history stretching back 7 years. Troy Brennan was officially dead, buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery. The funeral had been attended by General Frank Morrison, who delivered a moving eulogy about sacrifice and heroism, while Linda Brennan stood in the front row, visibly pregnant and apparently devastated by grief. Marcus Webb rented a modest apartment in Seattle and established the legitimate business infrastructure of a security consulting firm. To anyone investigating his activities, he appeared to be a former military contractor building a civilian career. In reality, he was conducting surveillance on Frank Morrison's extended network and preparing for Phase 1 of his operation. The key insight that guided Troy's planning was simple. Frank Morrison's strength came from his position within the military hierarchy. Remove him from that environment, and he became vulnerable to civilian law enforcement, civilian justice, and civilian enemies. Troy's first target wasn't Frank Morrison, it was his credibility. Using intelligence gathered from Dale's files, Troy began an anonymous communication campaign with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. The information was carefully curated to raise questions about Frank Morrison's operational decisions without revealing the full scope of his treachery. Why had so many of Morrison's intelligence assessments proven inaccurate? Why did enemy forces seem to anticipate operations that Morrison had helped plan? Why had Frank Morrison been granted unusual access to classified information despite his administrative role? Each inquiry was supported by carefully selected evidence that appeared to come from multiple independent sources. Troy had learned during Black Ops missions that the most effective way to destroy an enemy was to make them destroy themselves through their own responses to pressure. Frank Morrison's reaction to the investigation was predictable. He began covering his tracks by eliminating evidence and silencing potential witnesses. This cover-up activity created exactly the pattern of suspicious behavior that would justify expanded investigation. While Frank Morrison dealt with increasing scrutiny from the Inspector General, Troy turned his attention to Linda. The pregnant widow of a war hero should have been untouchable, protected by sympathy and social convention. But Troy knew his wife better than anyone, and he understood her fundamental weakness. Linda Brennan could not resist inserting herself into other people's drama. Troy created that drama by establishing a false identity as David Chun, a military journalist investigating inconsistencies in Colonel Troy Brennan's final mission. David Chun contacted Linda Brennan directly, expressing confusion about certain aspects of her husband's death that didn't align with official reports. Why had Troy volunteered for a solo mission when standard protocol required squad support? Why had the compound been destroyed so thoroughly that positive identification was impossible? Why had General Morrison been so quick to recommend Troy for posthumous honors when their professional relationship had been reportedly strained? Linda's responses to these questions revealed the depth of her involvement in Frank Morrison's operation. She volunteered information about Troy's erratic behavior in the weeks before his deployment, his obsession with classified material, and his increasing paranoia about military leadership. Each conversation was recorded, building a comprehensive file that demonstrated Linda's knowledge of classified operations she should never have accessed. More importantly, her eagerness to disparage her dead husband's reputation revealed the coldness that had allowed her to betray him. The psychological pressure began to show results within 2 weeks. Frank Morrison was drinking heavily, making mistakes in his communication security, and growing increasingly paranoid about potential threats. Linda was taking sedatives to manage anxiety while simultaneously trying to maintain the public facade of a grieving war widow. Neither of them suspected that their greatest enemy was operating freely in their world, invisible and patient. Troy's breakthrough came when Frank Morrison made a critical error. He contacted Dale Morrison's supposed grave site in Afghanistan to verify that his brother was actually dead. This communication was intercepted by Dale, who was very much alive and monitoring all traffic related to his official demise. Frank's message was revealing. Need confirmation that all loose ends have been properly tied. Family business requires absolute certainty. Dale's response was perfectly crafted. All accounts settled as agreed. No outstanding debts remain. Business concluded satisfactorily. But Frank Morrison was too paranoid to accept this confirmation. He began his own investigation into his brother's death, using military resources to examine the compound destruction and body identification process. This investigation created exactly the evidence trail that Troy needed to justify Phase 2 of his operation, direct confrontation. Because Frank Morrison was no longer just covering up his crimes, he was actively using military resources to investigate military operations, crossing lines that would justify intervention by military intelligence. Troy smiled as he monitored Frank's increasingly desperate communication patterns. The general was about to discover that some ghosts were more dangerous than any living enemy he had ever faced. And this particular ghost had been waiting 3 weeks for Frank Morrison to make exactly this mistake. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. Kevin Morrison sat in his West Point dormitory room, staring at the envelope that had arrived by overnight delivery. No return address, no identifying marks, just his name written in block letters across expensive stationery. Inside was a single photograph and a note typed on plain paper. The photograph showed his father, General Frank Morrison, accepting a briefcase from a man Kevin didn't recognize. The timestamp indicated it had been taken 6 months ago at a restaurant in Alexandria, Virginia. The note was brief. Your father has been selling classified information that resulted in American deaths. If you want proof, meet me at the Jefferson Memorial tomorrow at 1400 hours. Come alone, or this evidence goes directly to the media. Kevin's hands shook as he examined the photograph. His father had raised him on stories of military honor, duty, and sacrifice. Frank Morrison was Kevin's hero, the man who had inspired him to attend West Point and pursue a career in military service. But the photograph suggested something unthinkable, that his hero was a traitor. Kevin had noticed changes in his father over the past year. Frank had been drinking more, spending money on expensive items he couldn't afford on a general's salary, and displaying a cynicism about military service that contradicted everything he had taught Kevin about honor and duty. More troubling were the consulting assignments Frank had asked Kevin to help with, delivering packages to civilian contractors, carrying messages between Frank and various business associates, and providing Frank with information about West Point security procedures and cadet schedules. At the time, Kevin had assumed these activities were legitimate military business. Now, reconsidering them in light of the photograph, he realized they might be something else entirely. The next afternoon, Kevin stood at the Jefferson Memorial wearing his West Point dress uniform and feeling like his entire world was balanced on the edge of a knife. The man who approached him was unremarkable in appearance. Average height, neutral clothing, the kind of person who could disappear in any crowd. Cadet Morrison, thank you for coming. Are you a reporter? Kevin's voice was steady despite his internal turmoil. I'm someone who knew your father's victims. The man handed Kevin a tablet computer. What you're about to see will change your life forever. You can walk away right now and pretend this conversation never happened, or you can learn the truth about what your father has been doing. Kevin took the tablet with hands that barely trembled. Show me. What followed was 47 minutes of evidence that systematically destroyed Kevin Morrison's understanding of his father, his family, and his own unwitting role in the operation. Financial records showing payments to Frank Morrison from arms dealers. Communication logs detailing the sale of operational intelligence. Most damning of all, recordings of Frank Morrison discussing the elimination of Colonel Troy Brennan and other soldiers who had discovered aspects of his operation. How many Americans died because of the information my father sold? Kevin's voice was barely audible. 47 confirmed. Probably more. Troy watched the young man's face carefully, recognizing the exact moment when Kevin Morrison's hero worship died forever. Your father involved you in his operation, Kevin. Those packages you delivered contained classified information. Those messages you carried were coordinating arms sales with enemy forces. Kevin looked up from the tablet, his eyes reflecting a pain that Troy recognized from his own mirror. What do you want from me? I want you to help me stop him. Why should I trust you? I don't even know who you are. Troy considered his next words carefully. This moment would determine whether Kevin Morrison became an ally or an enemy. My name is Troy Brennan. Your father sent me on a suicide mission to eliminate me as a witness to his operation. I'm supposed to be dead, killed in action while rescuing your Uncle Dale. Kevin's face went white. Colonel Brennan? But you were killed in Afghanistan. My father spoke at your funeral. Your father spoke at the funeral of an empty coffin while believing I was dead. Your Uncle Dale and I faked our deaths to escape his cleanup operation. Troy sat down next to Kevin on the memorial steps. Your father murdered my marriage, corrupted my wife, and tried to have me killed. But his greatest crime was involving you in his operation without your knowledge or consent. What happens now? Troy handed Kevin a second tablet containing detailed plans for Frank Morrison's exposure and prosecution. Now you choose who you want to be. You can be Frank Morrison's son, inheriting his crimes and sharing his disgrace. Or you can be Kevin Morrison, a West Point cadet who chose honor over family when forced to decide between them. Kevin studied the plans, understanding their implications. This will destroy him completely. Yes. And my mother? My sister? They'll be humiliated, investigated, possibly prosecuted as accessories. Your mother divorced your father 2 years ago and has no knowledge of his operation. Your sister is serving in the Peace Corps in Guatemala and has been out of contact with Frank for 18 months. They're innocent. Kevin nodded, recognizing the careful attention to collateral damage. When do we start? Troy smiled, recognizing something of himself in the young man's decision. We start by recording your father's confession. He thinks you're a loyal asset who will help him escape investigation. Instead, you're going to help him confess to every crime he's committed. How? Tomorrow night, your father is planning to transfer $300,000 in cash from his offshore accounts to a safe deposit box in Switzerland. He'll need your help to carry the money without attracting attention. During that operation, you'll be wearing a wire that will record everything he says. Kevin stood up, his posture straightening into the bearing of a soldier preparing for battle. What about Colonel Brennan's wife, Linda? Troy's expression didn't change, but Kevin noticed his hands tighten slightly. Linda Brennan will face justice for her crimes. That justice may not come from a courtroom. Kevin understood the implication and found that it didn't disturb him as much as it should have. Some betrayals were too profound for civilian justice. Colonel, what happens after we destroy my father? Troy looked at the Jefferson Memorial, thinking about sacrifice and service and the price of honor. After we destroy your father, you return to West Point and become the kind of officer he pretended to be. You serve with honor, protect American soldiers, and never forget the cost of betrayal. And you? Troy stood up, already becoming invisible again. I disappear. Marcus Webb retires to civilian life, and Troy Brennan stays dead. As Kevin watched Troy walk away, he realized he was no longer Frank Morrison's son. He was a West Point cadet who had chosen honor over blood, duty over family, and justice over loyalty. Tomorrow night, he would help destroy the man who had raised him, and he would do it without hesitation or regret. Chapter 8. Confessions of a Dead Man. Frank Morrison's hand shook slightly as he poured his third scotch of the evening, ice clinking against crystal in his Arlington townhouse. The Inspector General's investigation was intensifying, and his carefully constructed network was beginning to unravel. Worse, someone was feeding investigators information that only a handful of people could have accessed. He had eliminated most of the potential witnesses over the past 2 years, but Troy Brennan's death had left one crucial loose end. the evidence Troy might have gathered before his deployment. Frank needed to retrieve and destroy any materials Troy had hidden, which meant gaining access to the Brennan house while Linda was at her prenatal appointment. Kevin arrived at exactly 2,000 hours, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a military-style duffel bag as instructed. Frank noticed his son's military bearing had become more pronounced over the past year at West Point. But tonight, Kevin seemed unusually tense. "Everything ready?" Frank asked, not noticing the nearly invisible wire running from Kevin's collar to a recording device taped to his chest. "Yes, sir. The cash is secured in waterproof containers, and I've arranged transport to Dulles Airport." Kevin's voice was steady, professional. "Dad, before we proceed, I need to understand exactly what we're doing. The amount of money involved suggests this isn't standard military business." Frank studied his son's face, recognizing something he'd taught Kevin during childhood: the importance of understanding your mission before executing it. "Kevin, what I'm about to tell you must never leave this room. Your future depends on your absolute discretion." "I understand, sir." Frank activated a signal jammer he'd installed to prevent electronic surveillance, not realizing that Kevin's recording device was designed to function through such interference. "For the past 3 years, I've been supplementing our family's income through intelligence consulting with various private contractors." "What kind of intelligence consulting?" "Operational assessments, threat analysis, strategic recommendations." Frank's voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had practiced this explanation. "Some of these contractors work in gray areas, Kevin. Not illegal, but not entirely sanctioned by official channels." Kevin maintained his neutral expression while internally recording every word. "Who are these contractors?" "Arms dealers, private military companies, intelligence brokers. They pay significant fees for information that helps them avoid conflicts with American operations." Frank finished his scotch and poured another. "The money we're transferring tonight represents payment for consulting services that will allow me to retire comfortably and ensure your education continues without financial concerns." "How much money are we talking about?" $3 million, accumulated over 3 years of consulting work. Kevin felt something cold settle in his stomach. His father's military salary was approximately $120,000 annually. Even aggressive saving couldn't account for $3 million in liquid assets. "Dad, where exactly did this money come from?" Frank's expression hardened slightly. "I told you, consulting fees from private contractors." "What specific information were you selling to these contractors?" The question hung in the air like a landmine waiting to explode. Frank realized his son wasn't asking for clarification. He was conducting an interrogation. "Kevin, why are you asking these questions?" "Because $3 million suggests you were selling more than assessments and recommendations." Kevin's voice remained calm, but his posture had shifted into the bearing of a West Point cadet confronting a disciplinary issue. "Because Inspector General investigators have been asking questions about operational security breaches in missions you helped plan. Because 47 American soldiers have died in operations that were mysteriously compromised." Frank set down his glass with deliberate precision. "What do you know?" "I know Colonel Troy Brennan discovered your operation and you sent him on a suicide mission to eliminate him as a witness. I know Uncle Dale has been feeding intelligence to enemy forces on your instructions. I know you've been using Linda Brennan to monitor Troy's activities and report on his psychological state." Frank's face went white, then red with rage. "Who told you this? Does it matter? The question is whether it's true." Frank Morrison looked at his son and realized he was facing a choice that would define the rest of his life: confess his crimes to the son he'd corrupted, or eliminate the son who had become a threat to his survival. "Kevin, you need to understand something about military service. Sometimes the greater good requires actions that appear questionable when viewed through narrow moral frameworks. Did you sell classified information that resulted in American deaths?" Frank's silence lasted exactly 37 seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried the tone of a man who had crossed too many lines to retreat. "Yes." "Did you send Colonel Brennan on a suicide mission to eliminate him as a witness?" "Yes." "Did you murder 47 American soldiers for money?" Frank finished his scotch and looked at his son with eyes that held no trace of the father Kevin had idolized. "I didn't murder them, Kevin. I simply failed to prevent their deaths when preventing those deaths would have been inconvenient to my business interests." Kevin felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, but his ability to love the man who had raised him. You're a traitor. I'm a realist. The military doesn't reward intelligence or initiative, Kevin. It rewards conformity and political correctness. I found a way to monetize my expertise while advancing my career, by betraying your oath and killing American soldiers. Frank stood up, his movement suddenly predatory. By ensuring my family's financial security through creative revenue streams that harmed no one I cared about. Kevin realized his father was reaching for the pistol he kept in his desk drawer. Dad, don't do something you'll regret. The only thing I regret is trusting you with information you're clearly not mature enough to handle. Frank's hand closed around the weapon. You're going to forget this conversation, Kevin. You're going to help me transfer this money, and then you're going to return to West Point and never speak of this again. And if I refuse? Frank's smile was cold and calculating. Then you'll join Colonel Brennan in the cemetery, and I'll report that you died in a tragic accident during spring break. Kevin looked at his father and realized he was facing the same choice Troy Brennan had faced. Submit to Frank Morrison's will, or fight back. Dad, there's something you need to know. What? Kevin smiled, and Frank Morrison saw something in that expression that made his blood freeze. Colonel Troy Brennan isn't dead. He's been listening to every word you just said. The front door exploded inward, and Frank Morrison's world ended forever. Chapter 9, Justice for the Dead. Frank Morrison spun toward the sound of splintering wood, his pistol half drawn, as three figures moved through his front door with the fluid precision of a coordinated assault team. The lead figure was impossible. Troy Brennan, supposedly dead for 3 weeks, very much alive, and holding a combat shotgun with practiced familiarity. Drop the weapon, Frank. Troy's voice carried the calm authority of a man who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Your son is wearing body armor, but you're not. Frank Morrison looked between his son, who had stepped clear of the potential line of fire, and the ghost of Troy Brennan, who was advancing with 2 additional men Frank didn't recognize. The tactical situation was hopeless. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing operators who had obviously planned this assault meticulously. Colonel Brennan, you're supposed to be dead. According to your plan, I should be. According to reality, your cleanup team killed 2 Afghan intelligence operatives while Dale and I watched from a safe distance. Troy gestured toward the second figure. Frank, meet your brother Dale. Very much alive, very eager to discuss family business. Dale Morrison stepped into the light, wearing civilian clothes but carrying military-grade weapons. Hello, Frank. We need to talk. The third figure was Master Sergeant Rico Vega, who had been conducting surveillance on Linda Brennan's location throughout the operation. House is secure, Colonel. Neighbors are clear, and we have electronic countermeasures active. Frank's mind raced through possible escape scenarios and found none. His house was surrounded. His son had betrayed him, and he was facing 3 special operations soldiers who had obviously been planning this confrontation for weeks. What do you want? He asked. Troy handed Kevin a tablet computer. We want you to watch the consequences of your actions. Kevin, start the first video file. The tablet screen filled with footage from a convoy attack in Iraq. Frank recognized it immediately. Operation Desert Rose, which he had compromised by selling the route information to insurgent forces. The video showed American soldiers dying in explosions and gunfire, their screams audible over the sound of automatic weapons. 17 Americans died in that attack, Troy narrated. The youngest was 19. Private First Class Sarah Martinez had been in country for 6 weeks. She was saving money to attend nursing school. Kevin watched his father's face as the video played, seeing no trace of remorse or regret. Frank Morrison observed the footage with the detached interest of a man reviewing tactical exercises. Next video, Troy commanded. The second video showed the aftermath of the failed raid on the terrorists' safe house in Kandahar. Bodies of American soldiers lay scattered in a courtyard that had become a killing field because the enemy had known exactly when and how the assault would commence. 12 Americans died because you warned the enemy 12 hours in advance, Troy continued. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez left behind 3 children under the age of 10. They watched 18 separate video files, each showing the direct consequences of Frank Morrison's betrayal. Soldiers dying in ambushes, convoys destroyed by precisely placed explosives, safe houses that became death traps because the enemy had been given detailed intelligence about American operations. When the final video ended, Troy looked at Frank Morrison with eyes that held no trace of mercy. 47 confirmed deaths. The actual number is probably higher, but we can only document cases where your intelligence directly resulted in casualties. Frank's voice was steady despite his circumstances. You can't prove any connection between my consulting activities and these incidents. Dale pulled out a recording device and pressed play. Frank's own voice filled the room. The convoy route needs to be adjusted to avoid the IED placement you reported. Make sure the alternative route takes them through the checkpoint where your people are positioned. I want this to look like standard insurgent activity, not a targeted assassination. We have 37 hours of recorded conversations, Dale explained. Every transaction, every order, every discussion about operational details you sold to enemy forces. Kevin looked at his father with undisguised disgust. You killed them for money. I killed no one, Frank replied. I simply provided information to business partners who used that information as they saw fit. Troy stepped closer, his shotgun remaining trained on Frank's center mass. Your business partners used that information to murder American soldiers. You are directly responsible for their deaths. Even if that's true, you can't do anything about it. You're supposed to be dead, Brennan. Any evidence you present will be dismissed as fabricated. Any testimony you give will be discredited. You've destroyed your own credibility by faking your death. Troy smiled, and Frank Morrison realized he had made a fundamental error in calculating his opponent's strategy. Frank, you're thinking like a soldier. This isn't a military operation. It's a civilian criminal investigation. Troy handed Frank a warrant signed by a federal judge. The FBI has been conducting a parallel investigation based on evidence provided by an anonymous whistleblower. They have sufficient probable cause to arrest you for treason, espionage, and 47 counts of felony murder. Through the window, Frank could see FBI vehicles surrounding his house. Agents in tactical gear were positioning themselves for a coordinated arrest operation. The anonymous whistleblower was your son, Troy continued. Kevin provided the FBI with evidence of your criminal activities, including the recording of your confession from tonight. He'll testify against you in exchange for immunity and dismissal from his unwitting involvement in your operation. Frank looked at Kevin with something approaching hatred. You betrayed your own father. You betrayed your country, Kevin replied. You betrayed your oath. You betrayed every soldier who ever served under your command. I chose honor over blood. Frank Morrison's world collapsed as federal agents entered through every door and window simultaneously. As he was handcuffed and read his rights, he looked at Troy Brennan with the expression of a man who finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. What about Linda? Frank asked. Troy's smile was cold and final. Linda is sitting in a federal holding cell, charged with conspiracy to commit treason and accessory to 47 counts of murder. She'll spend the rest of her life in federal prison, assuming she survives long enough to stand trial. She's pregnant. She was pregnant with your child while married to me. The child will be born in prison and placed in federal custody. Linda will never see freedom again. As federal agents led Frank Morrison to the waiting vehicles, he turned back toward Troy. You've destroyed everything. No, Frank. You destroyed everything. I just made sure you understood the cost. 3 months later, Kevin Morrison graduated from West Point with honors and received a commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. He requested assignment to Afghanistan, where he would spend 2 years building infrastructure projects that protected American soldiers from the kind of attacks his father had enabled. Dale Morrison disappeared into the civilian intelligence community, where his expertise in counterterrorism operations made him a valuable asset to organizations that preferred to remain anonymous. Linda Morrison was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. She gave birth to Frank Morrison's son in a prison medical facility and never saw the child again. Frank Morrison was convicted of treason and 47 counts of felony murder. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection, a sentence that was carried out 18 months later at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Troy Brennan attended the execution, sitting in the witness gallery and making eye contact with Frank Morrison during his final moments. Frank died knowing that his greatest enemy had outlived him, outlasted him, and would continue living free while Frank's legacy was nothing but shame and betrayal. After the execution, Troy Brennan disappeared forever. Marcus Webb continued operating his security consulting business in Seattle, building a quiet life far from the military world that had defined his previous existence. But on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the world was silent, Marcus Webb would remember Colonel Troy Brennan and the 47 American soldiers who had died because Frank Morrison valued money more than honor. Justice had been served, but the dead would never rest easy, and neither would the man who had survived to remember them.